My name is Avery. I'm 31 years old, and 6 weeks ago, at my parents' 35th anniversary dinner, in front of 42 people who had known me since I was in diapers, my mother-in-law stood up from her chair, clinked her wine glass, and told the room that her son had married beneath himself. She said it with a smile. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the words, but the smile. Like she'd been saving it. I didn't throw my napkin down, I didn't make a scene. I picked up my water glass, took one slow sip, and sat very still while the table went quiet in that particular way, where everyone is suddenly fascinated by their bread plates. And I made a decision. A quiet one. The kind that doesn't need to be announced. But I need to take you back, because this story doesn't start at a dinner table in Scottsdale, Arizona. It starts in a break room in Portland, Oregon, 8 years ago, when I was 23, and eating a granola bar for the third consecutive dinner, because I had $47 left in my checking account, and payday was 4 days away. My maiden name is Avery Colton. I grew up in Bend, Oregon. The second of 3 kids, middle child. The quiet one who read too much and got decent grades, and was never quite the story anyone wanted to tell at family gatherings. My older brother Seth was the athlete, state champion wrestler, full ride to Oregon State, the kind of guy who walks into a room and people just naturally face toward him, the way sunflowers track light. My younger sister, Becca, was the baby, the charming one, the one who could cry on command and make my mother abandon any position she'd been holding. I was the one who kept the peace, who cleaned up after dinner without being asked, who got a 3.8 GPA and heard nothing about it because Seth had just gotten recruited and Becca had just gotten the lead in the school play, and there were only so many hours in a day. My parents weren't cruel. I want to be fair about that. My father, Ron, is a decent man who worked 22 years for a lumber supply company in Redmond and coached Seth's wrestling team on weekends and genuinely loved all 3 of his kids. But love, I have learned, is not the same as attention. And attention is not the same as belief. When I was a senior in high school, I applied to the University of Oregon's business program. I got in. It wasn't a full scholarship. Those went to kids with better test scores or harder luck stories than mine. But I qualified for enough financial aid that the gap was manageable. About $9,000 a year, which in 2012 felt like a canyon. I sat down with my parents at the kitchen table in February. I had printed out the financial aid letter. I had a plan. I was going to show them the numbers. My father looked at the letter for a long time. My mother was on the phone in the other room. I could hear her laugh at something. Avery, he said finally. We just don't have the flexibility right now. I asked about the savings account. The one my grandmother Flo had been contributing to since I was 7. The one I'd been told my whole life was for college. He looked somewhere to the left of my face and said that things had come up. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't know for another 7 years, was that 3 months before that conversation, my parents had quietly co-signed a $38,000 loan to help Seth open a gym. He'd had the idea for about 6 weeks at that point. He'd never run a business. He was 24 and charismatic and completely convinced that a CrossFit-style facility in Bend was going to make him a millionaire. The gym lasted 14 months. I enrolled at Portland Community College. I told myself it was a detour, not a destination. I got a part-time job answering phones at a property management company called Ridgeline Residential, making $12 an hour, and I started paying attention. Not to the phones, to the business. I watched how the leasing agents talked to prospective tenants. I watched how maintenance requests got triaged and which ones the property owners actually cared about. I read every lease I could get my hands on. I took a free online course in property management through the National Apartment Association website, then another one, then a bookkeeping certification through Coursera at 11 p.m. after my shifts. I got my Oregon property management license at 22. I was still in community college. By the time I was 24, I had an associate's degree and a job offer from a mid-sized property management firm in Portland called Cascadia Partners. The woman who hired me, a compact, no-nonsense woman named Gloria Fenn, looked at my resume for about 45 seconds and said, "You taught yourself all of this?" I told her I had. She said, "Good. That usually means you actually know it." I worked at Cascadia for 3 years. I learned everything. Lease negotiations, vendor contracts, HOA disputes, fair housing law, eviction proceedings, the unglamorous infrastructure of how residential real estate actually runs. I was good at it in the way that people who have spent their whole lives being overlooked are often good at things. Quietly, thoroughly, without expecting anyone to notice. My mother called every few weeks. The calls were pleasant and short. She would tell me about Seth's latest pivot. After the gym, there was a food truck, then a landscaping business he started with a friend from high school. And about Becca's new apartment, and her marketing job, and the guy she was dating. She would ask if I was seeing anyone, and I would say not really, and she would say, "Well, you should get out more, Avery. You work too much." She wasn't wrong about the working. She was wrong about what it was for. When I was 26, I met a man named Daniel Marsh at a mutual friend's backyard barbecue in Southeast Portland. He was a structural engineer, quiet in the same way I was quiet, the kind of person who asks you a real question and then actually listens to the answer. We dated for 2 years. He proposed in the kitchen of the apartment we'd started sharing on Hawthorne, over pasta he'd made from scratch. No restaurant, no audience. Just us. It was perfect. His family was from Scottsdale. His mother, Roberta, was a retired orthodontist with a golf membership and a very clear idea of what her only son's life was supposed to look like. I understood from the first time I met her that I did not fit that picture. She was never rude to my face. That's what made it so effective. She asked questions that were shaped like compliments. You work in property management? How practical. She mentioned Daniel's ex-girlfriend, a woman named, well, I won't use her name, but she was a surgeon, with a kind of wistful frequency that I eventually understood was intentional. She talked about Portland with the tone of someone describing a place where a minor inconvenience had once happened to them. Daniel saw it. He told me so. He also told me his mother was difficult but ultimately harmless, and I believed him, because I wanted to. And because the alternative was a weight I didn't want to carry into a marriage I was genuinely happy about. We got married in September. Small ceremony in the Columbia River Gorge, 40 people. My grandmother Flo, in the front row, with a corsage she'd picked out herself. I want to pause here and tell you something about my grandmother. Florence Colton. She was my father's mother, 81 years old, sharp as a tack, retired schoolteacher from Bend who had voted in every election since 1964, and still did the New York Times crossword in pen. She called me her sensible one, which sounds like faint praise, but from her was the highest possible compliment. She was the only person in my family who ever asked, when I told her about a work problem, what I thought the right solution was. Not as a rhetorical question, but because she actually wanted to know. She passed away 8 months after our wedding. I flew back to Bend for the service. I cried in a way I hadn't cried in years, the kind of grief that catches you off guard at the exact moment you think you're holding it together. In the weeks after the wedding, while Daniel and I had been settling into our new apartment, and I had been quietly, methodically building towards something I'd been planning for almost 2 years, I started laying the groundwork for what would become Hearthstone Property Group. Let me tell you what that actually looked like. Because I think people imagine a company launch involves some dramatic moment of inspiration. It didn't. It looked like me, at our kitchen table at 6 in the morning before Daniel left for work, reading Oregon LLC formation documents, and drafting an operating agreement with help from a small business attorney named Beth who I'd found through a referral, and who charged me $175 an hour, and was worth every penny. I had $31,000 saved. I put $24,000 into the business. The rest was a cushion I refused to touch. I had learned, watching Ridgeline and Cascadia for years, that the margins in property management are real but slow. And the fastest way to fail is to run out of runway before the contracts start compounding. I registered Hearthstone as a single-member LLC. I kept my name completely off the website, the marketing materials, everything. The public-facing name was the company. The contact was Beth's office. The reason for that wasn't paranoia. It was precision. I had watched what happened when my family found out about things I was building. The questions became suggestions. The suggestions became opinions. The opinions had a way of becoming obstacles. I was not going to give them the chance. I worked Hearthstone in the early mornings and evenings for the first 18 months while keeping a reduced role at Cascadia. By the time I was 28, Hearthstone was managing 62 residential units across Portland and Beaverton. By 29, it was 140. By 30, I had 6 employees, an office in the Pearl District, and annual revenue just under $1.4 million. Daniel knew. He had known from the beginning. That is the thing I want to be clear about. My husband is not part of this story in any way that involves a villain arc. He knew. He believed in it. He never once suggested I was overreaching. When I told him the revenue numbers after our first full year, he looked at the spreadsheet and said, very seriously, Avery, you're going to need a bigger office. That was the most romantic thing he said to me that year, and I mean that genuinely. Now here is the part that I still find hard to say out loud, not because it's painful, but because it's almost too perfectly ironic. About a year and a half ago, Roberta, my mother-in-law, and her husband Gerald purchased a small investment property in Tigard, Oregon, a 6-unit residential building, their first real estate investment. Part of a retirement diversification strategy their financial advisor had recommended. They needed a property management company in the Portland metro area. They asked Daniel for a recommendation. Daniel, to his credit, did not say a word to me first. He forwarded them Hearthstone's inquiry email and said, "This company has a great reputation." They contacted Beth's office. Beth screened them, same as any client. I reviewed the application. I took the account. For 14 months, Hearthstone handled everything: tenant screening, lease execution, maintenance coordination, Rent collection, monthly owner statements. Gerald emailed once to say it was the smoothest rental experience he'd ever heard of. Roberta mentioned to Daniel at Christmas that she'd finally found a property management company she could trust. And, weren't they lucky? She had no idea she was paying me. Daniel knew. He had chosen not to tell her. Not out of malice, but because, and I remember his exact words, "You should get to decide when and how she finds out. It's your company." I loved him for that. My parents' 35th anniversary dinner was Roberta's idea, actually. She offered to host it at her country club in Scottsdale. My parents were flattered. My brother Seth flew in from Boise, where he was now working in sales for a medical device company, his 4th job in 6 years. My sister Becca came with her boyfriend. Daniel and I flew down from Portland. I wore a dark green dress that I'd bought at a boutique on Mississippi Avenue. My grandmother Flo's pearl earrings. I looked, I think, like exactly what I was. Someone who had quietly built something real and no longer needed anyone's permission to know it. Dinner was lovely. The food was good. The speeches were warm. My father told a story about the first apartment he and my mother had shared, the radiator that clanked all winter, and people laughed. Becca gave a toast that was genuinely funny. I was relaxed in a way I hadn't expected to be. Then Roberta stood up. She had not been given the microphone. She simply stood, and the room oriented toward her the way rooms do for women who have spent decades expecting exactly that. She talked about Daniel, his career, his kindness, his integrity. She said she was proud of him in the way only a mother could be. And then she looked at me. Avery has always been. She paused, just long enough, finding her path. You know, not everyone takes the traditional route. Some people figure it out a little later. There's nothing wrong with that. She smiled. We love her, and we know Daniel loves her, and we just hope she finds something that really sticks. A few people smiled politely. My mother looked at her wine glass. I counted to 4. Then I set my napkin on the table and I stood up. I didn't reach for a microphone. I just stood and spoke clearly enough that the table could hear me, which wasn't hard, because the room had gone the particular kind of quiet that follows something that everyone knows was wrong. I want to say something, I said. Since we're celebrating the people we love. I looked at my parents. Mom, Dad, 35 years is something, I mean that. Then I turned to Roberta. You mentioned I'm still finding my path. I want to be honest about where I actually am. I kept my voice even. I had not planned this speech. I want you to know that. But I had been living with these sentences for a long time, and they came out cleanly. The property management company handling your Tigard investment. The one Gerald described as the smoothest experience he'd ever had. That's my company. I started it 4 years ago. I own it. It has 6 employees and manages over 140 residential units in the Portland area, and last year it cleared just under $1.4 million in revenue. The table was completely silent. I didn't take a traditional route, because the traditional route wasn't available to me. I looked at my parents when I said that, not with anger, with precision. And I'm not saying that to make anyone feel bad tonight. I'm saying it because I have spent a long time allowing myself to be described as a work in progress by people who weren't watching what I was building. I sat back down. I picked up my fork. I finished my dinner. Daniel's hand found mine under the table and squeezed once. The drive back to the hotel was quiet, not uncomfortable. The kind of quiet that comes after a thing has been said that needed saying. I watched the Arizona lights out the window and felt, more than anything, like I could finally breathe the whole way in. Let me step outside the story for a moment and speak to you directly, if you have ever been the family member people describe with kind condescension. Oh, Avery's still figuring things out. She'll land somewhere. While you are quietly, methodically at 6 in the morning before anyone else is awake, building something they can't see yet. This is for you. If you've ever been the one who was never quite the story worth telling, the one who got straight A's while someone else got the trophy, the one whose wins went unwitnessed while someone else's losses became emergencies. I see you. Drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if you've ever had to correct the record in a room full of people who had already made up their minds. I read every single one. I want you to know that. Now, here's what happened in the weeks after. Because that dinner turned out to be the beginning of something. Not just the end of something else. 3 days later, my father called me. Not my mother. My father on his cell phone, which he almost never uses for calls. He's a texter, which still surprises me because he learned on a Motorola Razr in 2004 and has never fully committed to the keyboard. He said, Avery, I want to talk about the college savings account. I went still. Your grandmother, he said, and then he stopped and started again. When your grandmother Flo was still alive. She told me once that she'd called the bank about her contributions to your account. The one we told you was for school. Another soft stop. I didn't know your mother had moved those funds. I found out last week, going through some old paperwork. I sat down on our couch. The Portland rain was coming sideways against the window. My mother had transferred the contents of my college savings account. Money my grandmother Flo had put in, Over 15 years. Money my father had added small amounts to when he could. Into their joint checking account the month before my senior year of college planning conversations. The account had held just under $22,000. My father had not known. I believe that. I believe it because he sounded, on that phone call, exactly like a man who has discovered something about his own life that he cannot unfind. I called Beth the next morning. She connected me with an estate's attorney she knew. It took 6 weeks, a formal request to our family's bank, and documentation of the original account's transaction history. But we were able to establish the transfer clearly. My mother, when contacted by the attorney's office, did not deny it. She said she had used the money to cover a gap in their expenses that year, and had intended to replace it. She had not replaced it. The recovered amount, adjusted for what could be traced, plus a negotiated resolution, came to $19,400. It was less than what had been taken. It was also more than I had needed it to be, by that point. But that wasn't really what this was about. I kept $1 of it, for documentation purposes. The remaining $19,399, I donated to the Portland Community College Foundation's Access to Education Fund, designated for first-generation students pursuing business and finance. I made the donation in my grandmother Flo's name. I found out through my sister Becca that my mother cried when she heard about the donation. I don't know exactly what that means. I've thought about it. I think she understood, finally, what the message was, not punishment but a correction. A rerouting of something that had been wrongly redirected. Roberta did not call me. She sent a text to Daniel that said the dinner had been a lot, and that she hoped we were all okay. Daniel read it to me and then put his phone coffin face down on the counter and said, "Do you want Thai food?" And I said yes, and that was the end of that conversation for that evening. She and I have since spoken twice. The second conversation was longer and harder than the first. She said things I think she meant, and I said things I know I meant, and we are somewhere now that is not warm, but is honest, which I think is more sustainable anyway. My father and I have talked more in the last 6 weeks than in the previous 3 years. He is a man who processed guilt quietly and sideways, the way people who were never taught to name emotions often do, but he is trying. I can see it and I'm choosing to meet it. Seth called. He was awkward and brief, which is his way of being sincere. He said, "I didn't know about the money, Avery." I said, "I knew that." He said, "You really built all that yourself?" I said I really did. There was a pause and then he said, "That's cool actually," which is the most Seth sentence that has ever been spoken and which I will carry with me for a long time. Today, Hearthstone Property Group has 9 employees. We are in the final stages of a contract to manage a new mixed-use development coming to the Lloyd District. 48 residential units above, a ground-floor retail corridor. It is the largest project we have ever taken on. I keep a photograph of my grandmother Flo on the window ledge above my desk. She's standing in front of her house in Bend, squinting into the sun, one hand raised against the glare. She looks skeptical of something, which was her default expression, which was one of the things I loved about her. I visit her grave when I can. I bring yellow tulips because she grew them every spring in a narrow bed along her front walk, and because I think she would appreciate the specificity. I did it, Grandma. I kept the books. I kept going. I kept showing up at 6 in the morning when no one was watching. That's all it ever was. I am not angry at my family. I want to say that clearly because I know this story sounds like anger, and it isn't. Anger is a door you keep your hand on. I put it down. I needed both hands for other things. What I have now is something I couldn't have named 5 years ago. It's the knowledge that the story people tell about you, the comfortable, condescending, wrong story, has no power over the facts. The facts don't need your permission or their acknowledgement. They just accumulate quietly, the way compound interest does, until one day the numbers are too large to ignore. You are not behind. You are not stuck. You are not still figuring it out. Just because someone decided to describe you that way, in a room full of people eating catered salmon, you are building something. Maybe no one can see it yet. That's fine. I saw mine every morning at 6 before anyone else was awake, and that was enough to keep going. If this story was yours too, in some form or another, I hope it gave you something to hold on to. I'm Avery, and I'm just getting started.